Now, I was born on 64th and Loomis, across from Ogden Park, a pretty deadly area historically. I don't know how much of the same it is over there today, but my earliest memories was seeing this huge park across the street from where I lived. But obviously being a baby, my first real memories come from the next place I lived, which was on 69th. Now, whenever you grow up somewhere, it's hard for you to imagine that the rest of the world is not the same. For instance, when I was 3 years old on 69th, a family member came to pick up me and my mom to take us somewhere. And that's when I got my first real Chicago experience. As a group of guys on one corner had to shoot out with the group of guys on the other corner, and so bullets were actually flying past all of us while we were on the sidewalk. But other than that, I'm not gonna lie, it was pretty quiet over there, at least from my perspective. But I wouldn't stay on the south side for long, because shortly after this is where I really spent the first part of my childhood on the west side. Now, I consider myself a Southsider because that's where I jumped off the porch and did everything, but I didn't actually get back to the South Side until I was 9 years old. So for now, we'll have to take our story to the West Side. But around this time is when I was first introduced to something that would get me into history and geography, which obviously helped me a lot with my channel and the videos I do today. I have an older cousin, and he was also living in Inglewood, and he gets in a lot of trouble, let's just say. And he definitely did when he was younger. But he ended up getting a gig with one of our cousins, and he actually was able to work with Disney and travel around the world. And it was a good thing too, because he kind of messed up some money with some guys in Inglewood, and basically if he didn't give this one guy $700, they would kill him. So he had to ask my auntie for the $700, and obviously she paid the guy because she didn't want a nephew to just die over $700. But anyway, I grew up hearing his stories whenever he would come back in town of how he was just in Germany or Japan or New York, all expenses paid because he was working with Disney as like a food vendor whenever Disney on Ice was going around the world. He would just basically sell the candy and toys. But obviously just being a kid, I never really got a chance to think much on it until I got older. And around this time, it was the early 2000s, and the streets in Chicago was a lot different than they are today. Gangs were still more organized, and the violence was much worse because of the 90s, where it was possibly the worst that it's been since the 70s. So in the early 2000s, all of this was just starting to go back down. But the city was a much uglier place 20 years ago. The first place I lived on the west side was kind of close to Oak Park, which is a suburb, so it wasn't much going on over there, at least not for me. I was 8 years old, but had I been older, it would have been a lot different. Because this same older cousin, whenever his job season was over, he would come back and stay with me and my mom. And he would tell me that there were certain blocks he couldn't walk down because the vice lords over there didn't recognize him, and they thought that he was a GD. Possibly because of some of his friends from the south side that they would see over the house with him. And I kind of did see some of this as a kid. My mom didn't drive because honestly the public transportation in Chicago is not that bad. You really can't get around safely on the bus and the train back then like you could today. But I remember when we were on the bus one night on the west side, just me and my mom, I was 8 years old. So the city buses in Chicago, if you look like someone they don't want on the bus driver will go past you. They will fly past the bus stop no matter if you're standing there or not. And so a rock ended up hitting the window and the bus driver stopped. And just like in a movie or something, whenever he stopped and opened the door, like 5 to 8 masked men hopped on the bus. And they were talking crazy, man. I mean, it looked like they was about to rob everybody on the bus. But then all of a sudden, my mom, this 5'1" lady, stood up out of her seat and said, "Hey, y'all need to calm down. I got my son with me." And to my surprise, the masked men looked around at each other and they said, "Hey man, y'all chill out. She got her shorty with her." Then they hopped off the bus. This is much different than things are today and how they will be when I grew up, because this was just part of the organization in the streets that was left over from the past decades. But I only stayed out west until I was 9 years old. The first place we lived in ended up getting sold and we had to move. In the second place, the landlord was a Mexican guy that even though he was only like 35 years old, he would always tell me and my mom that in a couple years he'd be retiring and moving to Acapulco. And he had a lot of money. The man had a fish tank in the walls that stretched throughout his entire unit. So he might have been doing a little something extra. And his last name was Flores, which makes me think that he may have been connected to the Flores twins, who were connected with the Sinaloa cartel back then. And I might not have been wrong, because all of a sudden one day, the feds had arrested him and seized his property for drug trafficking. And this led to us having to leave the west side. And this is when most of my memories kick in from growing up, because now we're back on the south side when we moved to 79th Street. And I hadn't really lived out south since I was a baby at this point. So all I knew about it was the stories from my family who were all from out south. But I immediately got a wake-up call because as soon as we moved into the unit, I walked outside as a little kid to explore the neighborhood, and I saw a girl ride up on her bike. We were both about 9 years old, but she had a scar on her face. And I asked her what happened, and she said that she had been attacked with a knife. And still to this day, I don't know the full story behind that. But what would cause a 9-year-old to be attacked in this way was just my introduction to the South Side. And this is when I started to see the last of the organization and gangs. You see, the block I lived on had been a GD stronghold for a while. In fact, it was one of the biggest hoods in Chicago because it was a large alliance between several different blocks, an alliance that no longer exists today. But at this point, all of the project buildings were still coming down, and the migration was still in full effect of people coming from these buildings and flooding into the neighborhoods and new alliances and enemies being made. And it seemed like at that point, the whole hood only had really one fallen soldier, and this was for a long time, until about 2008, 2009, and this is when all the alliances that made the early drill era so deadly started to take place. As I noticed that my neighborhood suddenly went from being all GD to I started hearing people saying insane. Now, I didn't really know what this meant until one of the older guys in my apartment building explained to me, as he was insane too, that this meant that he was a GD that would go to war with other GDs if it came to that. And then I started hearing people say BDK, which I still didn't know what it meant at the time, only being 13 years old. But then, once I was close to going to high school, I had heard horror stories from high school growing up from my other cousin who went to Inglewood High School. So, not gonna lie, I was kind of nervous about going to high school, and right before I did, there was a kid named Darion Albert who was killed in a mass brawl that took place outside of a school when he was just watching the fight. But I still wanted to go to high school around my area because there was at least people I was familiar with. But my mom decided that I should go to a military school, at least just freshman year, because she didn't want me to get in trouble hanging out with everybody I knew. And man, I hated this idea. But turns out, the school she sent me to wasn't what she thought. If you don't know what an alternative school is, it's the school that the kids get sent to that were expelled from every other school in the city. What I found out was that a military school is just another alternative school. So most of the students there had gotten expelled from middle school and were not eligible to just go to any high school in Chicago. Like for instance, when I first got to this military school, which was on 35th on the low end, one of the first guys I met, he went in the classroom and locked the door behind him with a mask on and proceeded to rob the entire class. And this school was just full of characters. So it was a lot more fun than I actually thought, but it didn't take me long to get into my first real conflict in high school. Because you see, on 35th Street, there's several schools in the area. And as I said, the drill scene was still just coming together. So right down the street was Dunbar, where L.A. Capone and a lot of Taekwon and Jaro City members went. Down the street was another alternative school, and all of us got out at the same time, and the Chicago police would be posted up on the main street until the bell rang. So it would look safe, but once the bell rang and everybody got out of school, the police officer's shift over there ended, so it actually became a free-for-all. And I used to take 1 or 2 city buses to get home, and it didn't take long before I started seeing people get snatched off the bus, people turning the bus off and getting stomped out. And by the way, yeah, if you've seen my other videos, you know that in Chicago, there's a switch on the back of the bus that you can just hit and disable the bus to where the bus driver won't even be able to turn it back on. And the gang members will use this button to their advantage to start a fight. Anyway, long story short, my mom realized the school was not what she thought it was, so she just let me go to school in my area around people that I knew. And this is when one of my homies was at my house over the summer, and he said, "Hey man, go on YouTube. I need to show you this song I just heard." And then he proceeded to pull up Chief Keef Bang, which was Keef's first song. And at first I thought, bro, this is trash. Turn this off. And he was like, "What? You tweaking? This cold. You don't hear that beat?" But little did I know what this would start, because not long after, a war had started from 61st to 65th that made that part of the city, for a time, the most dangerous area you can be in. The guys over there had family ties to my neighborhood. So all of a sudden, I started seeing people migrate from my neighborhood to go join this war, and other people that were against it. As all of a sudden, I would see the guys I grew up with in the middle of the street yelling BDK, cracking trays at cars that were passing by. BDK parties started happening. It was always dangerous to go to house parties, and I started going to house parties pretty early at around 12 years old in the city. But it was only around this time that they would start ending very bad. And it didn't take long for this movement to spread all over the city. You see, there was always gangs and gang violence. But what the drill era brought was renegade. There was no more rules and no more regulations. All of a sudden, you got guys that were going against their own nation on the south side and the west side. And all of a sudden, my neighborhood, which was one giant hood that was all together, suddenly splintered, turning the middle ground of it into an actual war zone, as you had one group of guys that came through on some get down or lay down type shit, or you was gonna be at war with them and they was gonna try to kill you every time they saw you, or at the very least beat you. I had a friend that was a real big follower, and he lived right in the area where they was telling people to get down. See, I lived in the heart of my neighborhood, so they never made it that far. But on my friend's block, they had started to take over. And they actually started on his block, so he was at the epicenter of it. But being GD was so important to him, and for a while, he couldn't even come outside of his own mother's house. And he had a hard time explaining to her why they possibly needed to move. He could have just not associated with it in any way and been neutral. But he wasn't, and as a result, him and his little brother had to start running for their life after school every day. And around this time in 2012, I started to hit a peak of places I was at getting shot up. As I discussed before in one of my videos, high school homecomings in Chicago are a little different than in other places. Now it's probably like this in cities like LA, New York, and Philly, and Miami maybe, but a high school homecoming in Chicago is not a formal affair, and it barely has anything to do with the school. At some of the biggest schools, they would just let any high school students come as long as they brought their high school ID. And this led to a lot of different hoods being in the same homecoming parties at the same time. And homecomings were by far the safest place to go to a party other than actual house parties. I remember at one point in time, man, where we were lucky to be at a house party for an hour, because at some point somebody's shoe would get stepped on, somebody would run into a guy that shot at them, or somebody that killed their homie, and the whole party would just go up. Even out in the suburbs, man, I remember me and my homie, when we was tired of getting shot at parties in the city, one of our other friends that lived on 79th had cousins out in Linwood in the suburbs. So we went to a party they had out there. It was actually being hosted at like this building. It wasn't a house party, and we might have been in there for 2 hours. Maybe, before I seen somebody walk in with a shirt that said RIP so-and-so, and that's not what you want to see. And so me and my homie, knowing how to read a room, we told the suburban dudes we was with, hey bro, it's probably time to go, because now we ain't the only ones in here from the city. And as soon as we left, man, their house was maybe 10 minutes away. But by the time we got back to their house, one of them got a call, and apparently somebody had died in there as soon as we left. And this was a trend for me, at least, from 2012 to 2014. I would be at the wrong place at the wrong time, but I would just so happen to leave just seconds or minutes before something happened. No lie. I remember me and 3 of my homies was walking from 79th to a store. These little Jehovah's Witness kids popped out of a car, and you know how it go. They was trying to talk to us, they passed out some pamphlets, and in this short amount of time that they was talking to us, we realized that somebody had just got killed on the block we were headed to. Had they not popped out the car to talk to us just for a couple minutes, we would have been right on the scene. But this kind of stopped me from playing sports. Due to everything going on in the streets and the fact that I didn't have a ride home, I would just have to make my own way. It led to me dropping out of sports so I could get back to my neighborhood after school, especially in the winter before the sun went down. My school was in a treacherous area, but the most treacherous part about it is that I wasn't from that neighborhood. And due to a lot of factors, mostly me just being lazy, I didn't end up graduating my senior year, so I just ended up getting a GED. It was just because I failed one class, but I wasn't about to come back and be a 19-year-old senior. But one of my homies, they ended up having to go to an alternative school that was so far from where he was from that he started hanging with a whole different crowd. And this actually led to me getting a call that he got shot. Now, he survived and recovered, but it was this for sure that let me know that I might need to figure out my next move. Because this guy, out of everybody I hung with, he was the one that hung outside the least. What happened to him was literally just wrong place, wrong time, with a little bit of combination of who he was with. And then all of a sudden, after my homie recovered, me and him were chilling, and we got a FaceTime call from one of our friends that we hadn't talked to in a few months. When we answered the phone, he was at a party, and we was like, where you at? And he said, bro, I'm in college. We was like, yeah, which one? He told us, and he said, hey man, they let anybody in, so y'all might as well apply. And all through high school, we had heard how hard it was to get into college, and you wasn't going to get in there without good grades. And I thought, well, we'll test that out and see if they really let anybody in. And to my surprise, we both got accepted. And this is what took me away from Chicago for the longest amount of time. Even though we was in a small, dingy country town, it felt like we were in Hawaii. But this opened my eyes a lot. I love Chicago, but just growing up on the side that I grew up on, it gave me a messed up view of the world that honestly took years for me to change. Them first 2 years at college felt like nothing but vacation, bro. To be able to walk around and hang out with all our friends at 3 o'clock in the morning, no gunshots, not hearing about no murders. But being young and stupid, I ended up getting kicked out of college, and I was back at my mama's house in Chicago. But it took me a couple years after that to realize that I wasn't living up to my full potential. And it didn't have nothing to do with Chicago. It was all me. So I grinded, worked a couple of dead-end jobs. I met my wife, we got a dog, and a little more time passed before I picked up a microphone and tried my hand at YouTube. And for the first year and a half, 2 years really, it wasn't going anywhere, but I had the main thing that you need when you're doing something like this, and that's faith. And after a lot of trial and tribulations, I am where I am today. And some of the stories of my upbringing probably make people glad that they never grew up in a similar circumstance. And some people, it just gives them flashbacks because they grew up in a similar circumstance. But let me tell you something, I wouldn't trade it for anything, man, because I got way more good memories than bad. And I always thank God, because make no mistake, I didn't make it out of Chicago alive because I'm smart or because I'm just a veteran or something. It was a blessing. But it could have been harder because I had a loving family and still do. But you gotta have faith. People will look anywhere for it. A fortune teller, a tarot card, or some type of substance abuse. But it's only one kind of faith that can pull you out of a bad situation. But I love you guys, man, and I want to thank you for 100K subscribers. And that's coming from a kid from 79th Street. I'll never forget them days when I used to stand on that bus stop on 79th freezing my ass off. And mostly freezing because I was probably trying to look cool and I didn't wear enough layers. But that's all I got for today. I'll see you next time.